What began as my mother-in-law's attempt to ruin our 5th anniversary celebration unexpectedly became the catalyst for exposing decades of family manipulation and financial deceit that I never saw coming. Standing in our carefully decorated dining room, watching Margaret Blackwell pour champagne down the front of my dress while announcing she was selling our family home, I realized I had a choice: to retreat in humiliation or to finally reveal the truth I'd been safeguarding for months. Sometimes life presents you with perfect moments disguised as disasters, and her crashing our intimate celebration would set in motion events that would transform not just my marriage, but 3 generations of family dynamics built on secrets and control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we continue, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I'm sharing a special follow-up about setting boundaries with difficult family members. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. I've always prided myself on understanding people's motivations. As a behavioral economist at Riverside University, my career revolves around analyzing why people make the financial decisions they do, especially the irrational ones. My parents, both high school teachers with modest salaries, had taught me that financial independence was the foundation of personal freedom. "Always maintain your own safety net, Eliza," my mother would say while balancing our family budget. At the kitchen table, money doesn't just buy things, it buys choices. Ironic, then, how completely I'd misread the financial motivations driving my mother-in-law's behavior until that rain-soaked evening last October, our 5th wedding anniversary. The day had started perfectly. James, my husband of 5 years, had taken a rare day off from his medical practice to help prepare our special evening. We'd decided on an intimate dinner at home rather than fighting anniversary crowds at restaurants. Our Victorian home, the one we'd spent 3 years renovating room by room, was the perfect setting with its bay windows overlooking the garden. James had painstakingly restored using his grandmother's original planting journals. "Do you think the table setting is too much?" James asked, adjusting the vintage crystal candlesticks that had been a wedding gift from his favorite aunt. These weren't just any candlesticks. They were family heirlooms that his mother Margaret had always claimed should have gone to her instead. "It's perfect," I assured him, surveying our dining room with satisfaction. The antique table set with the china we only used for special occasions, flowers from our garden arranged in my grandmother's vase, and James's carefully selected wine breathing beside handwritten menu cards. This anniversary felt particularly significant after the challenges of the past year, James's grueling schedule as his medical practice expanded, and my promotion that had required extensive travel. What made the evening even more special was its privacy. For the first time since our wedding, we'd managed to plan a celebration without Margaret's interference. James had finally set a boundary with his mother, declaring our anniversary off-limits after years of her coincidental interruptions or emergency phone calls whenever we had something important to celebrate. She actually wished us happy anniversary. "Yesterday," James mentioned with surprise as he adjusted the playlist he'd created for dinner. "No guilt trip or medical emergencies. Maybe she's finally accepting that our marriage isn't temporary." I smiled but said nothing, not wanting to ruin the moment with reminders of Margaret's 5-year campaign to undermine our relationship. From the moment James had announced our engagement, his mother had made it clear that she considered me unsuitable for her only son. I was too career-focused, too independent, and most unforgivably, not from the right kind of family. Never mind that my wrong kind of family had produced a daughter with a PhD and a successful academic career. The doorbell rang precisely at 7:30 p.m., just as we were pouring our first glasses of wine. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked, smoothing down the burgundy dress I'd bought specially for the occasion. James shook his head, looking confused. "Absolutely not. Maybe it's a delivery?" When he opened the front door, the sound of Margaret Blackwell's distinctive laugh filled our hallway. Surprise, darling. I was just passing and thought I'd drop by to see my favorite son and his wife on their anniversary. She swept in before either of us could respond, designer raincoat shedding droplets across our freshly polished entryway floor. At 62, Margaret maintained the carefully preserved beauty of a woman who considered aging optional and financial constraints for other people. Her perfectly highlighted hair, immaculate makeup, and perpetual air of superiority had intimidated me when I first met her 5 years earlier. Now they just exhausted me. "Mother," James said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "We discussed this. Tonight is our anniversary dinner, just the two of us." Margaret waved away his objection as if it were cigarette smoke. "Don't be silly, darling. Family is always welcome. Oh my, what a cozy little setup you've managed here." Her gaze swept critically over our carefully arranged dining room, lingering on the candlesticks with a slight narrowing of her eyes. "It's not that we don't appreciate the thought," I began diplomatically, "but we specifically planned an intimate dinner." "Eliza," she interrupted, "you're always so concerned with your precious plans. Life happens while you're making plans, you know." She deposited her designer handbag on our sideboard, nudging aside the special bottle of port we'd been saving for after dinner. "I've brought champagne. We should celebrate properly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before either of us could protest further, she'd produced an expensive bottle from her oversized handbag and was heading toward our kitchen for glasses. James shot me an apologetic look, mouthing, "I'll handle this," before following his mother. From the kitchen, I could hear their hushed and tense conversation. James's insistence that she respect our boundaries. Margaret's practiced hurt response about being excluded from family celebrations. The familiar guilt triggers she'd perfected during James's childhood rising to the surface. References to her sacrifices as a single mother, her loneliness, her only wanting to be part of her son's life. When they returned, I knew from James's expression that Margaret had won yet again. She'd be joining our anniversary dinner. "I've opened the champagne," Margaret announced triumphantly, carrying a tray with 3 flutes. "James, darling, run out to my car. I've brought a little gift for you both. It's on the back seat." The moment James left the room, Margaret's demeanor changed. The pleasant smile vanished, replaced by the cold assessment I'd become familiar with over 5 years of uneasy family gatherings. "I won't be staying long," she said, her voice dropping to ensure James wouldn't overhear from the front door. "I just wanted to share my news personally. I'm selling the house." My confusion must have shown on my face because she clarified with obvious satisfaction. "The family home, where James grew up. The property that's been in his father's family for 3 generations." She poured champagne into the flutes with deliberate precision. "It's simply too much for me to maintain on my own, and property values in the neighborhood have skyrocketed. I've had a very attractive offer." The significance of her announcement wasn't lost on me. The Blackwell family home wasn't just real estate, it was James's emotional anchor, the place where his happiest childhood memories had formed before his father's death, the garden where his interest in botany had developed under his grandmother's guidance, the library where his dream of becoming a doctor had taken root among his grandfather's medical books. James had always spoken of one day raising our own children there, a dream Margaret had consistently deflected whenever he broached the subject of buying the house from her. "It will be yours eventually," she'd always said. "Why rush things? You know this will always be our family home." "You can't sell it," I stated flatly. "You've promised James for years." "I can do whatever I want with my property," she interrupted, her voice taking on the condescending tone she reserved specifically for me. James may have had some sentimental notion about the house, but sentimental notions don't pay for roof repairs and property taxes. The reality is, I need to secure my financial future. I heard James returning from her car and prepared myself for his reaction to her news. Margaret, however, had other plans. As James entered with an elaborately wrapped package, she stepped toward me with a flute of champagne extended. "A toast to the happy couple," she announced with a dramatic flair that should have warned me of what was coming. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Margaret's foot caught on the edge of the dining room rug, a stumble that somehow appeared both genuine and precisely calculated. The champagne flute tipped forward, its contents emptying directly onto the front of my burgundy dress. The cold liquid shocked me into momentary stillness as it soaked through the fabric. "Oh my!" Margaret exclaimed with theatrical dismay. "How terribly clumsy of me. Your lovely dress is ruined. Perhaps you should go change while James and I catch up. We have so much to discuss about the family home." As I stood there, champagne dripping from the dress I'd carefully selected for our special evening, watching James's concerned expression shift toward his mother, something crystallized within me. This wasn't just another of Margaret's orchestrated interruptions. This was a power play, one in a long series that had shaped James's life and was now affecting our marriage. "No need to change," I said calmly, dabbing at my dress with a napkin. "It's just champagne. And actually, Margaret, I think we should all discuss the family home together, since it concerns all of our futures." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her perfectly made-up face, the first genuine reaction I'd seen all evening. She hadn't expected resistance. "What's this about the family home?" James asked, setting down the forgotten gift package. Margaret recovered quickly, reaching for his arm with practiced maternal concern. "Darling, I was going to discuss this with you privately, but since Eliza insists on being involved, I've decided it's time to sell the house. It's simply become too much for me to manage alone." I watched the color drain from James's face as his mother continued outlining her plans. The real estate agent she'd already contracted, the asking price well above what James could afford on a young doctor's salary, her intention to move to a luxury condominium overlooking the river. With each detail, I could see the weight of disappointment settling on my husband's shoulders, his dream of continuing his family's legacy slipping away. "But you always said," he began, his voice uncharacteristically small. "Darling, we all say things," Margaret dismissed. "But financial realities change. The truth is, I need the capital from the house to fund my retirement. Surely you wouldn't begrudge me security in my golden years." I recognized the manipulation for what it was, the guilt trip, the false dichotomy, the reframing of her desires as needs. Classic Margaret tactics I'd observed for years but had kept my peace about for James's sake. But something about this moment, perhaps the ruined anniversary, perhaps the culmination of 5 years of similar manipulations, pushed me past my usual restraint. "Actually, Margaret," I said, setting down my champagne-dampened napkin, "there's something you should know about the family home." My phone buzzed with a notification. Perfect timing. I retrieved it from my pocket and pulled up the confirmation email I'd received that morning, the one I'd planned to show James over dessert as my anniversary gift to him. "What Eliza means?" James interjected, clearly trying to prevent what he assumed would be a confrontation. "Is that we've always hoped to buy the house from you someday. It means so much to our family history." "It's not for sale to you, James," Margaret stated firmly. "The numbers simply don't work. The buyer I've found is offering cash, well over market value. I'm sure you understand that I have to be practical." "The house isn't for sale at all, Margaret," I said quietly, handing my phone to James. "Because it's already been sold. The closing was finalized this morning." James stared at my phone, screen in confusion, then dawning comprehension as he read the confirmation from our attorney. The silence that filled our dining room was absolute. No background music, no polite conversation, just the sound of Margaret's suddenly accelerated breathing. "What is she talking about, James?" Margaret demanded, her composure cracking. Don't, James began, looking between my calm expression and his mother's increasingly agitated one. Eliza, how is this possible? I think, I said carefully, taking back my phone, that Margaret should explain how she attempted to sell a house that hasn't legally belonged to her for nearly 15 years. The flush that spread across Margaret's cheeks had nothing to do with her expertly applied blush. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely at a loss for words. That's impossible, she finally managed. The house has been in my name since Charles died. Everyone knows that. Actually, I continued, maintaining a calm I certainly wasn't feeling as years of research and planning culminated in this moment. The house was placed in a family trust when your husband died. A trust that transferred ownership to James on his 30th birthday, which was almost 5 years ago. The trust documents are quite clear. You've had lifetime tenancy rights, but the property itself has belonged to James for years. Margaret's composure slipped further, her carefully manicured hand gripping the back of a dining chair for support. Those trusts were dissolved. My attorney handled it years ago. Your attorney attempted to dissolve the trust, I corrected. But since James was the legal beneficiary, that dissolution required his signature. The document that was filed had a signature, but it wasn't James's. The implication hung in the air between us. James looked from me to his mother, the pieces falling into place with almost audible clicks. Mother, he said slowly, did you forge my signature on legal documents? Margaret's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, anger, calculation, and finally a manufactured version of maternal concern. Darling, you were just starting medical school. You didn't need the burden of property ownership. I did what any mother would do. Protected you from complications you weren't ready for. By committing fraud? I asked quietly. That's a very serious accusation from someone who claims to have mysteriously purchased a house that wasn't for sale, Margaret snapped, her composure reassembling itself. I don't know what game you're playing, Eliza, but this has gone far enough. I reached for my phone again, this time pulling up a different document. The forensic handwriting analysis I'd commissioned 6 months earlier when I'd first discovered the trust discrepancy while researching a surprise for our anniversary. It's not a game, Margaret. I discovered the trust documents while trying to arrange transferring the house into both our names as an anniversary gift for James. When I found the dissolution paperwork with James's supposed signature, something felt off. James was on his surgical rotation that month. He wasn't even in the country on the date this was supposedly signed. James took the phone from me, examining the document with growing disbelief. The signature does look like mine, but... He turned to his mother, the hurt in his eyes painful to witness. Why would you do this? Why not just tell me about the trust when I turned 30? Margaret's strategy shifted visibly, her shoulders squaring as she moved from denial to justification. The house needed extensive repairs that you couldn't afford as a resident. The property taxes alone would have bankrupted you. I protected our family home by maintaining control of it until you were established. And the $400,000 second mortgage you took out against the property 3 years ago? I asked. Was that also for James's protection? The color drained from Margaret's face. This was information she clearly hadn't expected me to have. James looked between us, confusion giving way to a dawning anger I'd rarely seen in my gentle husband. You mortgaged our family home? He asked incredulously. The house that was paid off when Dad died? The home that's been in our family for generations? What happened to that money, Mother? Margaret's composure cracked completely then. You have no idea the sacrifices I've made for you. Do you think your fancy medical education paid for itself? The private schools? The European summers that gave you such cultured polish? Your father left us with almost nothing but that house. Dad left a fully funded education trust, James countered, a new certainty in his voice. I've seen those documents. which barely covered your undergraduate years. Medicine was your dream, James, not mine. I did what was necessary to give you every advantage. As their conversation unfolded, revealing layers of financial manipulation I hadn't even discovered in my months of research, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The champagne drying uncomfortably on my dress seemed trivial compared to the unraveling of decades of careful deception. My phone buzzed again. Another email from our attorney confirming that the trust restoration had been legally recorded. The house that Margaret had been trying to sell to cover mounting debts was officially recognized as James's property once more, with my name now added to the deed as his wife. Our anniversary gift to each other was secure. I think you should leave now, Mother, James said quietly after several minutes of increasingly circular arguments. Eliza and I have an anniversary to celebrate, and you and I have a lot to process before we speak again. Margaret gathered her designer handbag with trembling hands, her earlier confidence replaced by a brittle dignity. At the door, she turned back, one last attempt at regaining control. This isn't over. My attorney will be contacting you both. I look forward to it, I replied calmly. I've compiled quite an extensive file for ours as well. After she left, James and I stood in silence in our champagne-splattered dining room, the carefully planned anniversary dinner forgotten. The confrontation I'd been preparing for over 6 months had unfolded in ways I couldn't have predicted, exposing financial manipulations far deeper than I'd initially suspected. How long have you known? James finally asked, his voice heavy with the weight of discovered deceptions. About the trust? 6 months, I admitted. I wanted to surprise you by adding my name to the deed for our anniversary, a symbol that everything we have is truly shared. When I couldn't find clear title documents, I started digging. He nodded slowly, processing this information. And you didn't tell me right away because at first I wanted it to be a surprise. Then, when I discovered the forged documents, I needed to be certain before making accusations that would change your relationship with your mother forever. I reached for his hand, relieved when he didn't pull away. I never anticipated she would try to sell the house out from under you. That forced my timeline. James looked around our dining room, the carefully set table, the special wines, the anniversary plans now thoroughly derailed. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A genuine laugh I hadn't heard in weeks. Only you, he said, pulling me close despite. My damp dress would give me a 100-year-old family home as an anniversary present. I smiled against his shoulder, feeling the tension begin to dissolve. To be fair, it was already yours. I just helped you reclaim it. Later that night, after we'd abandoned our ruined dinner plans in favor of takeout eaten while sitting on our kitchen floor, James asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happens now? I took a sip of the special port that had survived Margaret's visit and considered my answer carefully. Legally, the house is secure. The trust has been properly reinstated with you as the rightful owner since your 30th birthday. I've added backdated property tax payments and set up an account for future ones. And my mother? He asked, the pain evident in his voice despite everything we'd learned. That's more complicated, I acknowledged. The forgery is a serious legal issue. The mortgage she took out fraudulently is another. However, I hesitated, knowing this next part was delicate. Those are your decisions to make, not mine. She's your mother, despite everything. James was silent for a long moment, twirling his port glass thoughtfully. You know what's strangest about all this? I keep thinking about those candlesticks she was eyeing tonight, my grandmother's candlesticks that Aunt Rebecca gave us. Mother always said they should have gone to her instead. What about them? I asked. I'm wondering now if that was just another lie. If grandmother actually wanted Rebecca to have them all along. He set his glass down with unexpected firmness. How many of my family stories are actually true? How much of my understanding of my own history is based on my mother's version of events? This was the question I hadn't anticipated. Not the legal or financial implications of Margaret's deceptions, but the existential ones. How does someone rebuild their personal history when the narrator proves unreliable? I don't know, I answered honestly. But I think that's something we can discover together. Your father's papers are in the attic of the family home. Margaret mentioned that once. Maybe it's time to look through them, to hear his voice directly rather than through her interpretations. James nodded slowly, a new resolution forming in his expression. I'd like that. And I think I'd like to reach out to Aunt Rebecca too. Mother always discouraged me from maintaining close contact, said she was bitter about the inheritance. But maybe that wasn't true either. As we sat on our kitchen floor, surrounded by takeout containers on our 5th anniversary, not at all how we'd planned to spend the evening, I realized that Margaret's unwelcome interruption had indeed become a catalyst, though not in the way she'd intended. What began as an attempt to maintain control through selling a house that wasn't hers had instead fractured that control permanently, creating space for new truths to emerge. Sometimes the moments that seem designed to break us become the very ones that set us free. The days following Margaret's anniversary ambush unfolded in a blur of legal consultations, emotional revelations, and unexpected discoveries. James and I spent a rain-soaked Sunday afternoon in the attic of the family home, now officially our home, sorting through dusty boxes his mother had claimed contained nothing of value. In reality, they held a treasure trove of family history. His father's medical journals, correspondence between his grandparents during World War II, and most significantly, a detailed letter from his father to James to be opened on his 30th birthday. She kept this from me for 5 years, James whispered, his fingers tracing his father's handwriting on the sealed envelope. The mixture of grief and betrayal in his voice made my heart ache. The letter, when James finally gathered the courage to open it, revealed a father's thoughtful guidance from beyond the grave, advice about marriage and career, reflections on family legacy, and explicit instructions about the trust that Margaret had attempted to dissolve. Dad knew, James said, looking up from the pages with reddened eyes. He anticipated that Mother might try to maintain control of the assets. That's why he structured the trust the way he did, with Rebecca as trustee instead of Mother. This revelation added another layer to Margaret's deception. Not only had she forged James's signature to dissolve the trust, but she had systematically alienated him from his Aunt Rebecca, the very person his father had entrusted with protecting his inheritance. I need to call Rebecca, James decided, carefully refolding his father's letter. Today. The conversation with his father's sister, a woman James hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade due to Margaret's insistence that Rebecca harbored unhealthy jealousy toward her, proved transformative. Rebecca's voice, warm and startled over the speakerphone, filled our living room with a perspective on the Blackwell family that contradicted nearly everything Margaret had led James to believe. Your mother didn't drive me away, James. I was pushed out because I questioned the financial decisions she was making after your father died, Rebecca explained. Charles was very clear about his wishes for you and for the family property. When I tried to enforce the terms of the trust as executor, Margaret threatened legal action that would drain the very resources intended for your education. So, you stepped back to protect my inheritance? James asked, struggling to reconcile this narrative with the story of a bitter, jealous aunt that he'd accepted for years. I stepped back to protect you, Rebecca corrected gently. Margaret made it clear that if I pursued the legal battle, she would restrict my access to you completely. You were 12, grieving your father. I couldn't bear to disappear from your life during that time. So I compromised. I maintained minimal contact under Margaret's terms while documenting everything in case you ever needed the truth. By Tuesday morning, Rebecca had emailed dozens of scanned documents. Trust papers, correspondence with attorneys, financial records she'd quietly maintained for 15 years. The picture they painted was more troubling than either of us had anticipated. Margaret hadn't just forged documents related to the house. She had systematically diverted funds from James's education trust to support her lifestyle, replacing them with loans against the family home that James was never intended to know about. She used my father's medical practice sale proceeds, money explicitly designated for my education, to renovate her bathroom with Italian marble and install a swimming pool, James said incredulously as we reviewed the financial trail Rebecca had preserved. Then she took out student loans in my name to actually pay for medical school, while telling me my father's foresight had covered everything. The student loans had been the most shocking discovery, nearly $200,000 in debt that James knew nothing about, with Margaret intercepting all correspondence by maintaining control of his childhood mailing address and creating email filters that redirected loan statements to accounts she monitored. But how did she make the payments? I wondered aloud, spreadsheets and bank statements scattered across our dining room table. You would have noticed if large sums were leaving your accounts each month. The answer emerged from Rebecca's meticulous documentation. Margaret had established a pattern of opening credit cards in James's name since his undergraduate years, using balance transfers to juggle payments between accounts, while creating an increasingly precarious financial house of cards. The recent attempt to sell the family home had been her desperate solution to decades of financial manipulation that was finally on the verge of collapse. She's destroyed my credit without me even knowing it, James realized, his medical practices, plans for expansion suddenly complicated by a financial history he hadn't created, and she nearly sold my birthright out from under me to cover it up. As a behavioral economist, I found myself analyzing Margaret's actions through my professional lens, even as I supported James through the personal betrayal. Her pattern was classic. Short-term financial decisions that prioritized immediate gratification over long-term consequences, followed by increasingly risky maneuvers to conceal the resulting problems. The psychological framework was textbook, but the emotional impact on my husband was devastatingly unique. I should have seen it, James said late one night, self-recrimination heavy in his voice as he stared at the ceiling above our bed. I've been thinking about what you said during the meeting, James. About understanding the family history that Margaret may have rewritten. I have all your grandmother's journals and photographs in storage. Perhaps it's time to create a more accurate family narrative together. The suggestion sparked something in James that weeks of legal discussions hadn't touched, a path forward that acknowledged the past's complexity while not remaining trapped by it. I'd like that, he said, the first genuine smile in days transforming his face. Our house has plenty of room for family archives. That evening, as we sat on the porch of our home, no longer just our renovation project, but now the repository of generations of Blackwell history, James looked out at the garden his grandmother had designed and asked the question that had been forming since our confrontation with Margaret. Do you think it's possible to break inherited patterns? To recognize the dysfunction you've been raised with and actually build something different? The question resonated deeply with my professional research on intergenerational financial behaviors, but my answer came from a more personal place. I think awareness is the essential first step. You can't change patterns you don't recognize. What you've done these past weeks, facing the truth about your mother's manipulation, establishing boundaries while still offering compassion, that's already breaking the cycle. James nodded slowly, considering my words. The irony is that if she'd simply been honest about the financial struggles after Dad died, I probably would have happily given up the house, the trust money, whatever she needed. It was the deception that created this entire situation, not the need itself. That's the tragedy of what Margaret did, I agreed. She was so afraid of appearing vulnerable that she sacrificed authentic connection for the illusion of control. As darkness settled around us, fireflies beginning to flicker in the garden, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a ruined anniversary dinner and a champagne-soaked dress. Margaret's attempt to maintain her web of deception by crashing our celebration had instead catalyzed its complete unraveling, creating space for a more authentic family narrative to emerge. "You know," James said thoughtfully, his hand finding mine in the gathering darkness, "when you first told me you'd discovered my mother's financial manipulations, I was horrified that you'd kept that investigation from me, even for a few months. But now I understand you weren't continuing her pattern of secrecy. You were gathering the complete picture before asking me to confront something so fundamental. I wanted to be certain," I acknowledged, "and to protect you from unnecessary pain if my suspicions proved unfounded. That's the difference between your actions and hers," he concluded. "Your secrecy was temporary and protective. Hers was permanent and self-serving. Intention matters." As we sat together, planning the renovations we'd make to the family home now that it was legally secured, I realized that Margaret's anniversary interruption had indeed been transformative, just not in the way she had intended. What began as her attempt to maintain control through selling a house that wasn't hers had instead created the conditions for James to reclaim not just his property, but his authentic family history and the possibility of a healthier future. Sometimes, the most powerful catalysts for positive change arrive disguised as our greatest challenges. Margaret's champagne may have ruined my anniversary dress, but it had ultimately revealed truths that no amount of celebration could have uncovered. Moving Margaret out of the family home proved more complicated than any of us had anticipated. What should have been a straightforward process of packing and relocating personal items became an archaeological excavation of decades of hidden financial documents, concealed valuables, and family heirlooms long assumed lost. "I thought these were sold years ago," James said, carefully unwrapping a set of sterling silver serving pieces from where they'd been hidden beneath the floorboards in Margaret's closet. According to family lore, these pieces had been regrettably sold to cover emergency expenses when James was in high school. In reality, Margaret had hidden them away, adding another fabrication to the family narrative. With each new discovery, jewelry tucked into hollowed-out books, stock certificates hidden in unused kitchen appliances, cash envelopes taped to the backs of artwork, the extent of Margaret's deception grew clearer. She had created an elaborate fiction of financial struggle while simultaneously hoarding significant assets. Rebecca joined us for much of the process, her organizational skills and historical knowledge proving invaluable as we sorted through generations of Blackwell possessions. Her presence also provided important emotional context for James, helping distinguish between Margaret's revised family history and the more authentic narrative his aunt remembered. "Your grandmother never intended those pearls for Margaret," Rebecca explained, as James uncovered a jewelry box containing an elaborate pearl necklace in Margaret's lingerie drawer. "Those were meant for your future wife. Mother was explicit about that in her will, but Margaret claimed they'd been stolen during a break-in the year after she died." I watched James absorb this information, adding it to the growing catalog of manipulations he was processing. Rather than becoming more bitter with each revelation, however, I observed a surprising transformation taking place. Each discovered deception seemed to liberate him further from the emotional control Margaret had maintained for so long. "It's strange," he commented as we boxed the recovered family silver for proper cleaning. "I should be getting angrier with each of these discoveries, but instead I feel increasingly free. Like I'm finally seeing the complete picture instead of the carefully edited version she presented all these years." This perspective shift became evident in how James approached the renovations to the family home once Margaret had relocated to the condo we purchased for her. Rather than attempting to restore the house exactly as it had been during his childhood, the approach he had initially planned, he began envisioning changes that honored the home's history while creating something new. "I've been thinking about opening up these walls between the kitchen and dining room," he suggested one evening, sketching possibilities on graph paper. Dad actually wanted to do that before he got sick. Mother always claimed he preferred the traditional layout, but I found his renovation notes in those attic boxes. This blending of recovered family history with forward-looking changes became our framework for approaching the house renovations. We began meeting with architects who specialized in historic homes, seeking the balance between preservation and reinvention that felt right for the next chapter of the Blackwell family story. Margaret, meanwhile, settled into the condo with surprising adaptability. The financial oversight committee established by our legal agreement, consisting of an accountant, a financial advisor, and a family therapist, reported that she was cooperating with the budgeting process, albeit with occasional resistance to the lifestyle adjustments required. "She's actually attending the financial literacy workshops," reported Sandra, the accountant overseeing Margaret's financial rehabilitation. "And she's begun sorting through her possessions to sell some designer items online. It's small progress, but significant, given where we started." This unexpected cooperation created space for a careful recalibration of family relationships. 6 weeks after our confrontation at the library, Margaret requested a meeting with James, alone, without lawyers or family members present. "Are you sure about this?" I asked as he prepared to meet her at a neutral cafe downtown. "The last time you saw her without buffers present was the night she crashed our anniversary." "I'm sure," he replied with a certainty I hadn't expected. "I need to have this conversation as her son, not as the victim of her financial fraud. There are questions only she can answer, and I want those answers without legal strategies influencing her responses." When James returned from that meeting 3 hours later, the emotional weight he'd been carrying for weeks seemed lighter, somehow. He found me in the garden where I'd been planting bulbs according to his grandmother's recently discovered seasonal rotation plans. "She finally told me about her childhood," he said, sitting beside me on the garden bench. "Not as a manipulation tactic or to excuse her behavior, but as context she thought I deserved to know." Margaret, it turned out, had grown up in financially precarious circumstances that she'd kept hidden from everyone, including her husband. Her father's gambling addiction had repeatedly destroyed her family's stability, creating patterns of sudden poverty interspersed with brief periods of apparent wealth. The shame and uncertainty of those experiences had shaped her relationship with money in profound ways, creating a deep-seated fear of financial insecurity that ultimately drove her increasingly desperate measures after being widowed. How many patients have I treated with vague symptoms that turned out to have parents with factitious disorder or other forms of medical manipulation? I can spot those patterns in strangers, but missed decades of financial abuse from my own mother. "Because she's your mother," I replied softly, reaching for his hand in the darkness. "We're programmed to trust our parents implicitly. It's a survival mechanism." And Margaret weaponized that trust masterfully. The legal implications of our discoveries mounted with each passing day. Our attorney, Elena Vasquez, didn't bother hiding her astonishment as the scope of Margaret's financial manipulations became clear. Identity theft, fraud, forgery, and that's before we even address the trust violations, Elena summarized during our Thursday consultation. The statute of limitations has expired on some of the earliest incidents, but the recent forgery and fraudulent mortgage are well within prosecutable range. You have decisions to make about how to proceed. The question of whether to pursue criminal charges against Margaret hung heavily between us. James oscillated between righteous anger and deep grief, sometimes within the same conversation. For my part, I found my initial satisfaction at exposing Margaret's deception giving way to genuine concern about the ripple effects of public legal proceedings, not just for Margaret, but for James's professional reputation and emotional well-being. "We need to at least speak with her directly before making any decisions," I suggested as we drove home from Elena's office. "Give her an opportunity to explain and perhaps make amends." James's laugh held no humor. "Make amends? For 20 years of systematic deception? For nearly selling my father's legacy to cover up her fraud? What possible explanation could justify any of this?" None, I acknowledged. But this isn't about justification. It's about information. We still don't know the full picture, and criminal prosecution would close the door on ever understanding her motivations. Don't you want to know why, James? Not just what she did, but why she felt she had to do it. His silence told me he was considering my words. By the time we arrived home, he had reached a decision. One conversation, with both of us present, and everything recorded. If she lies even once, we proceed with pressing charges. Arranging the meeting proved challenging. Margaret had retreated to her sister's vacation home 2 states away, her phone going straight to voicemail. The certified letters our attorney sent were returned unopened. It was Rebecca who finally facilitated contact, reaching out through family connections to deliver a simple message: cooperate or face the legal consequences. Margaret agreed to meet us at a neutral location, a private room at the city library where Rebecca served on the board. The week between scheduling the meeting and the actual confrontation tested our newly discovered solidarity. James vacillated between determination to hold his mother accountable and anxiety about facing the woman who had shaped his understanding of family, albeit through manipulation and deceit. What if I can't go through with it? He confessed the night before our scheduled meeting. What if I look at her and all I can see is the mother who sat by my bed when I had chickenpox, who came to every school play, who proudly displayed my medical school acceptance letter on the refrigerator for months? Then we adjust our approach, I assured him, understanding the complex intersection of love and betrayal he was navigating. This isn't about punishing Margaret. It's about establishing truth and boundaries. We can do that in different ways if necessary. The Margaret who appeared at the library meeting room bore little resemblance to the confident woman who had crashed our anniversary dinner. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple sweater and slacks, her perfect makeup absent, revealing the true age her cosmetic procedures usually concealed. Most striking was her demeanor, the imperial certainty replaced by wary defensiveness as she entered the room where James, Rebecca, and I waited with our attorney. "I see you've assembled quite the tribunal," she remarked, attempting to summon her usual sardonic tone but achieving only brittle nervousness. "Is this an intervention or a sentencing?" "That depends on you, Mother," James replied, his voice steadier than I had anticipated. "On whether you're finally ready to tell the truth." What followed was a 3-hour conversation that peeled back decades of deception, layer by painful layer. Margaret initially attempted her standard tactics: selective memory about financial decisions, reframing of manipulative actions as maternal protection, subtle guilt triggers about familial loyalty. But faced with Rebecca's documentation, the trust paperwork, and James's unwavering insistence on honesty, her defenses gradually crumbled. "You have to understand the position I was in when your father died," she eventually said, tissues shredded between her fingers. Charles had built this image of financial security, but he'd over-leveraged the medical practice expansion. The accounts I could access immediately were nearly empty. The house was paid off, yes, but everything else was tied up in trusts and insurance policies with disbursement restrictions. "So you decided to simply ignore those restrictions?" Rebecca interjected, skepticism evident in her tone. "I did what was necessary to maintain our lifestyle," Margaret countered defensively, "to ensure James wouldn't suffer socially during a vulnerable time. Do you have any idea what it's like to suddenly be a doctor's widow instead of a doctor's wife? The expectations don't change, but the resources vanish overnight." As Margaret continued justifying her initial financial decisions, the diverted trust funds, the concealed insurance payouts, a pattern emerged that even she seemed unaware of. Each questionable choice had led to another, then another, creating a cascade of financial deceptions that required increasingly desperate measures to conceal. "Why didn't you just tell me?" James asked during a momentary lull. "When I finished residency and started earning a real salary, why continue the deception? I would have helped you. The question seemed to genuinely confuse Margaret. Tell you that I'd spent your inheritance? That the education your father had promised was actually funded by debt in your name? That I'd been lying to you since you were 12 years old? She shook her head slowly. There was never a good time to unravel that web. So instead, you tried to sell the house to cover everything before I discovered the truth, James concluded, the final pieces falling into place. You weren't planning to use that money for retirement. You needed it to pay off the fraudulent mortgage and credit cards before the whole system collapsed. Margaret didn't deny it. Her silence was confirmation enough. As the conversation progressed from establishing facts to discussing consequences, I observed a subtle shift in James's demeanor. The initial righteous anger had transformed into something more complex, a grieving acceptance combined with resolute boundaries. Here's what's going to happen, he finally said, after conferring quietly with me and our attorney. We won't be pressing criminal charges. Margaret's relief was palpable until he continued. But there will be conditions. Strict, non-negotiable conditions. Those conditions, carefully outlined in the legal agreement our attorney had prepared, represented a balanced approach to accountability that protected James's interests while offering Margaret a structured path forward. She would undergo financial counseling and regular budget oversight. The credit cards and loans fraudulently opened in James's name would be legally transferred to her, with a negotiated payment plan. She would sign a notarized confession detailing her actions to be held in escrow and only filed if she violated the agreement's terms. Most significantly, Margaret would vacate the family home within 30 days, moving into a modest condo that we would purchase for her use, but not ownership. The family home would remain James's property, with me added to the deed as planned. This is quite generous considering the circumstances, our attorney remarked as Margaret reviewed the documents. More generous than I would advise, frankly. It's not about generosity, James replied quietly. It's about breaking a cycle that's damaged our family for decades. More punishment wouldn't accomplish that. Margaret signed the agreement with trembling hands, the flourish of her signature, lacking its usual confidence. As our attorney notarized the documents, I studied my mother-in-law's face, seeing for perhaps the first time the vulnerable woman beneath the manipulative facade. Someone whose own insecurities and fears had driven her to choices that ultimately isolated her from the very family connection she'd been so desperate to control. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said to James as we prepared to leave, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. But I am sorry. Not just for getting caught. For all of it. The acknowledgement, however belated, seemed to provide James with something he needed. His shoulders straightened slightly as he replied, Forgiveness isn't a single decision, Mother. It's a process. And that process can't begin without truth. At least now we have that. As we left the library, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the parking lot, Rebecca approached us with an unexpected proposal. It doesn't excuse anything she did, James emphasized. But for the first time, I can see her actions as the manifestation of untreated trauma rather than pure selfishness. She never developed healthy financial coping mechanisms because she never saw them modeled. This insight proved transformative for how James approached the ongoing family healing process. Rather than viewing Margaret's financial rehabilitation as primarily punitive, he began seeing it as the therapeutic intervention she had needed for decades. The boundaries remained firm, but the perspective behind them shifted from protection against manipulation to support for recovery. This evolution in James's thinking influenced my professional work as well. As a behavioral economist who studied financial decision-making, I had always acknowledged the impact of early experiences on adult financial behaviors. But witnessing the powerful influence of Margaret's unresolved childhood insecurities on her subsequent choices added nuanced understanding to my academic approach. I incorporated these insights into a journal article I was developing on intergenerational financial trauma, using anonymized elements of Margaret's behaviors as a case study in how unaddressed financial wounds can create cascading consequences across multiple generations. When the article was accepted for publication in a prestigious economic psychology journal, it represented both professional advancement and personal integration of the difficult journey our family had experienced. The most unexpected development in our evolving situation came 4 months after our confrontation with Margaret, when Rebecca discovered a safe deposit box key among the items recovered from the family home. The box, registered in Margaret's name at a bank across town, contained documents none of us had anticipated. Correspondence between Charles Blackwell and his attorney regarding concerns about Margaret's financial behavior dating back to the early years of their marriage. "He knew," James said quietly, reviewing letters that revealed his father had been aware of Margaret's tendency toward financial secrecy and manipulation long before his death. He established those trusts and restrictions not just for estate planning purposes, but specifically to protect assets from her control. This revelation might have reignited James's anger at his mother. Instead, it deepened his understanding of the complex dynamics that had shaped his family long before he was old enough to recognize them. Charles Blackwell emerged from these documents as neither hero nor villain, but as a husband attempting to balance love for his troubled wife with protection for their son's future, an imperfect solution to a situation with no perfect answers. Dad tried to create financial guardrails for Mother while he was alive, James observed. When he knew his illness was terminal, he strengthened those structures through the trusts. But he couldn't have anticipated how resourceful she would become in circumventing them after he was gone. Armed with this more complete understanding of his parents' relationship, James initiated another conversation with Margaret, this time with my presence requested by both of them. We met at the family home, which now bore the visible signs of our renovation work. Walls opened between previously closed-off spaces, windows enlarged to welcome more natural light, the dark wood paneling that had made rooms feel oppressive replaced with warm, neutral tones. Margaret noticed these changes immediately, her expression flickering between disapproval and reluctant appreciation as James guided her through the transformed space. "It's so different," she finally said, the word carrying complex emotions. Charles would barely recognize it. "Actually," James replied, "many of these changes were ideas Dad had noted in his renovation journal. We found it in the attic boxes you said contained nothing important." The direct reference to her deliberate concealment might once have triggered Margaret's defensive deflection. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting the gentle confrontation. "There are many things I should have shared with you over the years. Your father's renovation plans are among the least significant." We settled in the sunroom, the one space we'd kept largely unchanged because of its perfect natural light and views of the garden. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of her chair, her composure a fragile veneer over evident nervousness. "I've been working with Dr. Winters," she began, referring to the therapist appointed through our legal agreement. "She's helping me understand patterns I wasn't fully aware of before." The careful phrasing reflected Margaret's ongoing struggle to directly acknowledge her deliberate deceptions. "Financial trauma can create powerful unconscious behaviors," I offered, bridging the uncomfortable silence. "Recognizing those patterns is significant progress." Margaret's gaze shifted to me, a flicker of surprised gratitude crossing her features. "At this minimal validation." "Yes, that's what Dr. Winters calls it. Financial trauma response. Apparently, I've been operating from a scarcity mindset despite objective evidence of security." Her hands twisted in her lap. "She says my childhood experiences created distortions in how I perceive financial boundaries." James leaned forward slightly. "Is that why you took out loans in my name even after I was earning a good salary?" Because you couldn't perceive the boundary between your resources and mine. The directness of the question created visible discomfort for Margaret, but she didn't retreat into her usual deflection. Partly, she acknowledged, but there was also shame. By the time you were financially stable, I'd already created such a tangled web that revealing it seemed impossible. Each new deception was an attempt to conceal the previous ones. As the conversation continued, Margaret revealed more about her therapy progress than I had anticipated she would be capable of at this stage. She acknowledged specific manipulations without minimizing them. She identified triggers for her most problematic financial behaviors. Most surprisingly, she expressed awareness of how her actions had affected James beyond the practical financial implications. I robbed you of the security of knowing your own financial truth, she said, the therapy-influenced language nevertheless conveying genuine insight. And I prevented you from developing a relationship with your father's legacy on your own terms. When James showed her the recently discovered correspondence between Charles and his attorney, Margaret's reaction was not the defensive anger I had anticipated. Instead, she looked at the letters with a sad resignation. Charles understood me better than I understood myself, she said quietly. He saw the patterns I was blind to, even then. If he had lived... She trailed off, then corrected herself. No, that's avoiding responsibility again. Even if Charles had lived, these issues were mine to address, not his to manage. This acknowledgement, that her husband's continued presence wouldn't have automatically resolved her deeply ingrained behaviors, represented significant growth from the woman who had crashed our anniversary dinner just months earlier. The Margaret who had poured champagne on my dress had been someone who viewed others as either tools for or obstacles to getting her needs met. The woman sitting across from us now was beginning to recognize the agency and separate experiences of people beyond herself. As our conversation concluded, Margaret surprised us with an unexpected proposal. I'd like to contribute to the renovation costs, she said. Not to reassert control, she added quickly, seeing James's skeptical expression, but as a form of practical amends. Dr. Winters suggested that concrete actions are an important part of rebuilding trust. James and I exchanged glances, having already discussed potential scenarios for this meeting. We appreciate the offer, he replied carefully, but given the history, direct financial entanglement isn't something we're comfortable with right now. Rather than the wounded response this boundary might have previously triggered, Margaret nodded with surprising acceptance. That's completely understandable. Perhaps there's another way I could contribute that doesn't involve financial complications. This opening led to a productive discussion about non-monetary contributions Margaret could make to the home restoration, sharing historical knowledge about original features, helping organize family photographs and documents, even assisting with planning a garden renovation based on her memories of plantings that had thrived in previous decades. As she prepared to leave, Margaret paused by the foyer table, where we'd displayed several family photographs discovered during our attic exploration. Among them was a picture of Charles holding infant James in the garden, Margaret watching them with unguarded affection, a moment of genuine family connection before financial deceptions began eroding their relationships. I'd forgotten how happy we were in those early years, she said softly, before my fears started overwhelming everything else. She turned to face us, visibly working to maintain her composure. I can't undo the decades of manipulation, but I am committed to not contaminating whatever future relationship we might be able to build. After she left, James and I sat in the sunroom reflecting on the unexpected evolution of our family dynamic. The confrontation that had begun with a ruined anniversary celebration had transformed into something neither punishment nor reconciliation, but a careful reconstruction of relationships based on truth rather than manipulation. Do you think she's genuinely changing, Or just adapting her strategy? I asked, aware that Margaret's history justified skepticism about her apparent insights. James considered the question with the careful analysis he brought to complex medical diagnoses. I think she's experiencing authentic moments of clarity alongside deep-rooted habits of manipulation. The progress isn't linear, and we need to maintain boundaries, but I do see genuine efforts at growth. This balanced perspective reflected James's own healing journey, the ability to acknowledge positive changes without naively dismissing the patterns that had caused so much damage. His willingness to create space for Margaret's potential transformation while maintaining necessary protection demonstrated emotional intelligence that made me deeply proud. The following weekend brought an unexpected opportunity to witness the practical application of these evolving family dynamics. Rebecca organized a family history day, inviting several extended Blackwell relatives James had rarely seen during his childhood due to Margaret's systematic isolation of their nuclear family. The gathering, held in our partially renovated home, centered around cataloging photographs, documents, and oral histories that would provide a more complete family narrative than the one Margaret had curated. Margaret had been invited with clear parameters. She was welcome to contribute to the family history project, but not to dominate or redirect it. To everyone's surprise, she attended with appropriate boundaries, sometimes quietly correcting dates or identifying faces in photographs, but mostly listening as older relatives shared stories that contradicted her previous versions of family events. "Your grandfather wasn't the stern businessman Margaret always described," James's elderly cousin Walter explained as they reviewed photographs from the 1950s. "He was actually known for his playfulness and generosity throughout the community. These family homes were open to anyone who needed help during difficult times." This portrayal contradicted Margaret's characterization of James's paternal grandfather as a cold financial pragmatist whose example justified her own emphasis on appearances over authentic connection. Watching James absorb these alternative perspectives on his family legacy, I witnessed another layer of Margaret's control being gently dissolved by more authentic narratives. Most revealing was a moment I observed from across the room, when Margaret found herself alone with Rebecca, while others were occupied with organizing materials. Instead of the awkward tension or passive aggression that had characterized their previous interactions, Margaret spoke briefly, then extended her hand. Rebecca hesitated before accepting it in a handshake that, while not warm, acknowledged the possibility of a relationship beyond adversaries. Later, Rebecca explained the exchange. "She apologized for how she treated me after Charles died, not a generic, 'sorry for everything,' but specific acknowledgement of how she deliberately alienated me from James and falsely characterized my concerns about the trust as selfish interference." Rebecca's expression remained cautious but thoughtful. "It doesn't erase 20 years of manipulation, but it's the first genuine accountability I've ever seen from her." These incremental steps toward family healing paralleled the physical restoration of the Blackwell home. Just as we were carefully removing damaged structural elements while preserving the architectural integrity, our family was navigating which relationship patterns needed complete reconstruction and which historical connections could be respectfully maintained. By the time autumn arrived, transforming the garden into the red and gold splendor captured in generations of family photographs, the renovation had reached a significant milestone. The structural work was complete, with new systems supporting the historic elements we'd chosen to preserve. The house had been transformed from a monument to Margaret's carefully maintained illusions into a living repository of authentic family history, both the accomplishments worth celebrating and the complications worth acknowledging. To mark this transition, we decided to host a small dinner gathering, not a housewarming exactly, but a conscious reclaiming of family celebrations that had for too long been dominated by Margaret's controlling influence. The guest list included Rebecca, several cousins rediscovered through the Family History Project, close friends who had supported us through the tumultuous months, and, after considerable discussion, Margaret herself. "Are you sure about including her?" Rebecca asked when we finalized the invitation list. "No one would blame you for maintaining more distance at this stage." "I'm sure," James replied with the quiet certainty that had increasingly characterized his decisions about family relationships. "Not because she's earned full trust yet, but because exclusion would reinforce the same divisive patterns we're working to break. She'll be a guest like everyone else. No special accommodations, no central role, just one thread in the larger family fabric." This framing, Margaret as one element of a diverse family ecosystem rather than its controlling center, represented perhaps the most profound shift in James's relationship with his mother. He had moved from defining himself in reaction to her manipulation to establishing his own vision of family that could include her in a bounded, appropriate way. The evening of the dinner arrived with perfect early autumn weather, allowing us to set tables on the patio overlooking the garden. The renovated kitchen, now open to adjacent spaces instead of isolated as Margaret had preferred it, enabled conversation to flow naturally between rooms as final preparations were completed. Margaret arrived precisely on time, carrying a houseplant rather than the elaborate floral arrangements she had once used to demonstrate her superior taste at family gatherings. "It's a peace lily," she explained somewhat awkwardly as she presented it. "The florist said they're good for purifying the air in new spaces." This simple, practical gift, so different from her previous performances of generosity, suggested a woman attempting to navigate unfamiliar relationship terrain without her usual manipulative tools. Throughout the evening, I observed her working to find this new balance, participating in conversations without dominating them, occasionally starting to correct someone's memory of a family event before visibly stopping herself, accepting her reduced role in the family hierarchy with minimal signs of resentment. The most revealing moment came during dinner when the conversation turned to family holidays. Cousin Walter mentioned the elaborate Christmas celebrations at the family home during Charles's childhood, traditions that had mysteriously disappeared after his marriage to Margaret. "We always wondered why those wonderful holiday gatherings stopped," Walter commented. "Charles had loved them so much as a boy." In the momentary silence that followed, I saw Margaret weighing her options. The habitual defense, the self-justifying explanation, the subtle redirection she had perfected over decades. Instead, she surprised everyone with unexpected candor. "I stopped them," she acknowledged quietly. "The extended family gatherings made me feel insecure. I didn't grow up with those traditions, and I felt like an outsider. Rather than admit that vulnerability, I convinced Charles that more intimate celebrations would be better for our own nuclear family." She looked at James. "I told you that. The larger family had drifted apart naturally, but the truth is, I deliberately created that distance." The acknowledgement hung in the air for a moment before Rebecca responded with equal honesty. "We should have worked harder to include you, meaningfully in those traditions instead of just expecting you to adapt to them. The family bears some responsibility for that dynamic too." This exchange, Margaret's ownership of her manipulative choice met with Rebecca's recognition of the legitimate needs beneath it, created a moment of authentic connection that would have been impossible months earlier. Neither woman was dismissing the damage done, but both were acknowledging the complex humanity behind the family fractures. As dinner progressed into dessert and conversations broke into smaller groups scattered across the patio and garden, I found myself beside Margaret near the rose bushes we had restored, according to her surprisingly accurate recollections of the original plantings. "The house feels alive again," she observed, her gaze taking in the gathering of family members who had been separated for years by her orchestrations. "Different than before, but alive." "That's what we hoped for," I replied. "Not to erase the past, but to build something honest from it." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "When I crashed your anniversary dinner, I was desperate to maintain control of a situation that was already far beyond my management. I thought selling the house would solve everything, cover the debts, hide the evidence, maintain the illusion I'd created. She touched a rose petal gently. I never imagined my interference would ultimately lead to this. A family reconnecting despite my best efforts to keep everyone compartmentalized. The self-awareness in her observations struck me as perhaps the most significant marker of change. The Margaret who had poured champagne on my dress had been incapable of seeing beyond her immediate tactical objectives to the larger patterns she was perpetuating. This Margaret, while still early in her recovery journey, was beginning to recognize how her actions had created consequences far beyond her intentions. Sometimes our worst moments create openings for transformation we couldn't have reached otherwise, I offered, thinking of how our ruined anniversary had ultimately led to this evening of authentic connection. Margaret considered this, her gaze following James as he laughed with cousins he was only now getting to know properly. I spent decades believing I was protecting this family by controlling its narrative, she said finally. It took losing that control completely to see what I was actually destroying. This insight, hard-earned and still fragile, represented the kind of growth that cannot be forced through confrontation alone, but emerges through the consistent commitment to truth that had guided our approach since discovering Margaret's deceptions. By maintaining boundaries without seeking vengeance, we had created conditions where authentic change became possible, not just for Margaret, but for the entire family system she had manipulated for so long. As the evening concluded and guests departed, James and I stood in the doorway of our reclaimed home, watching the taillights of cars disappearing down the tree-lined drive. The house behind us, no longer a repository of Margaret's carefully maintained illusions but a space for authentic family connections, felt different in ways that transcended the physical renovations. "Do you think we did the right thing?" James asked quietly. "Including her in this new chapter instead of making a cleaner break?" I considered the complex evening we'd just experienced, the awkward moments alongside genuine connections, the history acknowledged alongside new possibilities explored. "I think we did the right thing for us," I replied. "The boundaries are clear but not punitive. The truth is acknowledged but not weaponized. It feels like healing rather than mere justice." James nodded, his arms settling around my shoulders as we turned back toward our home. From a ruined anniversary to a reconnected family. Not the transformation I would have predicted, but maybe the one we needed. The champagne stain on my anniversary dress had long since been cleaned, the garment now hanging in our closet as a reminder of the unexpected catalyst that had transformed not just our understanding of family history, but our approach to building a more authentic future, one where truth, however uncomfortable, served as the foundation for genuine connection rather than convenient illusions. 1 year after Margaret crashed our anniversary dinner, James and I found ourselves preparing for a different kind of celebration in the fully renovated family home. What had begun as a project to reclaim physical space had evolved into something far more meaningful, a conscious reimagining of family legacy that honored authentic history while creating new traditions. "Do you think we're tempting fate?" James asked, carefully arranging vintage photographs on the entry table. "Hosting an anniversary dinner exactly 1 year after the champagne incident?" I smiled at his concerned expression, appreciating how far we'd come that we could now reference that pivotal evening with humor rather than pain. Maybe we're not tempting fate so much as acknowledging its strange gifts. Without Margaret's interruption last year, we might never have uncovered the truth about the house or your family history. The renovation was finally complete, transforming the Blackwell family home in ways that balanced preservation and reinvention. Working with restoration specialists and architectural historians, we'd maintained the distinctive period features that gave the house its character while opening spaces that had previously been compartmentalized, a fitting metaphor for the high family healing that had occurred alongside the physical restoration. Most significant were the changes to the home's historical displays. Rather than presenting the curated family narrative Margaret had maintained, a sanitized vision of uninterrupted privilege and success, we'd created a more authentic representation of the Blackwell legacy. Photographs now included family members Margaret had deliberately excluded. Historical documents acknowledged both achievements and struggles across generations. The family's story was presented as a complex human journey rather than a carefully manufactured myth of perfection. "Rebecca just texted that they're running about 15 minutes late," James said, checking his phone. "Walter found more photographs he wants to bring for the family archive." The family archive had been one of our most meaningful projects, a dedicated library space where we were systematically organizing documents, photographs, and recorded oral histories from extended family members. What began as an effort to reconstruct the accurate family narrative Margaret had distorted had evolved into a deeper exploration of intergenerational patterns, resilience strategies, and the subtle ways family stories shape individual identities. "Perfect timing," I replied, making final adjustments to the dining room table. "That will give Margaret time to settle in before everyone else arrives." The decision to include Margaret in our anniversary celebration had been deliberate, not from obligation, but as acknowledgement of the significant changes we'd all navigated over the past year. The woman who had once crashed our intimate dinner to maintain control was now arriving as an invited guest, with clearly established boundaries, participating in a family gathering whose purpose she hadn't orchestrated. Her punctual arrival, exactly at the time specified in our invitation, reflected her ongoing efforts to respect the new relationship parameters. The Margaret who entered our home carried a simple gift bag, rather than making a dramatic entrance, her designer outfit notably more subdued than the power-signaling ensembles she'd favored in the past. "Happy anniversary," she offered, handing me the gift bag with uncharacteristic awkwardness. "It's a crystal vase. Rebecca mentioned you collect vintage crystal, and this was my grandmother's. I thought perhaps it should be with someone who would appreciate its history." The gesture, returning a family piece rather than claiming exclusive ownership of it, represented a small but meaningful shift in how Margaret approached family possessions. The previous year had been filled with such incremental changes, moments when she chose truth over convenient fiction, collaboration over control, appropriate boundaries over entitled overreach. "Thank you," I replied sincerely, recognizing both the physical gift and the emotional progress it represented. "It's beautiful, and we'll treasure its connection to your side of the family." As Margaret moved into the living room with James, I observed their interaction with the perspective of both family member and behavioral scientist. Their conversation had the careful quality of a relationship being consciously rebuilt, neither the performative closeness Margaret had once insisted upon, nor the reactive distance that might have followed our confrontation. Instead, mother and son were establishing a new dynamic based on current reality rather than manipulated history. By the time Rebecca arrived with Walter and several other extended family members, Margaret had settled into a role that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. One family member among many, rather than the central authority controlling the narrative. She participated in conversations without dominating them, occasionally offering historical context about family photographs, without insisting her version was definitive. Most striking was her interaction with Rebecca, the sister-in-law she had systematically alienated for decades. The two women would never share the easy affection of close friends, but they had developed a functional relationship based on their shared connection to family history and their mutual commitment to supporting James's more complete understanding of his heritage. "I found these in Mother's hope chest," Rebecca explained, carefully unwrapping photographs that showed a teenage Charles at a family lake house. "I believe this property was sold during the Depression, but the family managed to keep an album of summers spent there." Margaret studied the images with genuine interest. "Charles mentioned that lake house several times when we were first married. He had such fond memories of it, but I never saw photographs before." She glanced at James. "Your father learned to sail there. He always wanted to teach you, but somehow we never prioritized it." This acknowledgement of opportunities lost through her controlling choices would once have been unthinkable for Margaret. Her ability to recognize, even partially, how her manipulations had limited James's connections to his father's experiences reflected the ongoing therapeutic work she had committed to after our confrontation. As dinner preparations continued, I found myself in the kitchen with Walter, the 82-year-old cousin who had become an unexpected bridge between family generations. His willingness to share unfiltered family stories had provided James with perspectives Margaret had deliberately concealed, helping rebuild a more accurate understanding of the Blackwell legacy. "You've done something remarkable here," Walter commented, gesturing toward the gathering of family members who had been effectively estranged before our discovery of Margaret's deceptions. Charles would be proud to see the family reconnecting like this. He always regretted how isolated they became after his parents died. "It's been a group effort," I acknowledged. "Everyone has contributed to rebuilding these relationships." Walter's eyes crinkled with gentle amusement. "True enough, but catalysts matter. Your decision to confront Margaret's deception rather than accommodate it created the opening for all of this." He glanced toward the dining room where Margaret was helping arrange place cards. "And your choice to establish boundaries without seeking retribution gave her a path to something better than she had created for herself." This balanced perspective on our approach to Margaret's deceptions aligned with my professional research on accountability systems. My academic work had always examined how consequences can be structured to promote genuine behavioral change, rather than mere compliance or avoidance. Our family's journey had become a lived case study in these principles, maintaining clear boundaries and consequences while creating conditions where growth became possible. As we gathered around the dining table, the same table where Margaret had spilled champagne on my dress a year earlier, I was struck by the significance of physical spaces in family healing. The renovated home, with its balanced preservation of historical elements and thoughtful creation of new gathering areas, provided a tangible representation of our approach to family legacy, honoring authentic history while creating space for new connections. James stood to offer a toast, his confidence in addressing the assembled family members reflecting his growing comfort with his reclaimed role as the Blackwell home's rightful steward. "A year ago tonight, our anniversary celebration took an unexpected turn," he began, acknowledging the elephant in the room with disarming directness. What seemed at the time like a disaster ultimately opened the door to discoveries that have transformed our understanding of family history and created opportunities for new connections. He raised his glass. "So tonight, I'm grateful for uncomfortable truths that lead to authentic healing, for family bonds that survive even decades of distance, and for the chance to create traditions based on genuine connection rather than careful performances." The gathered family members raised their glasses in response, the atmosphere warm with the particular intimacy that comes from shared acknowledgement of difficult journeys. Even Margaret participated in the toast, her expression reflective rather than defensive at the reference to her anniversary interruption. As dinner progressed, conversations flowed across generations and family branches, creating connections that had been systematically discouraged during Margaret's reign as family gatekeeper. I observed James absorbing family stories he had never heard, asking questions about relatives he had barely known existed, gradually filling gaps in his understanding of his own heritage. During a pause in the meal, Walter surprised everyone by retrieving a small package from his coat pocket. "This seems an appropriate moment to return something to its rightful place," he said, unwrapping a small object and placing it at the center of the table. "This compass belonged to your great-grandfather James. It guided him when he first purchased the land this house stands on." The brass compass, tarnished with age but still functional, gleamed softly in the candlelight. Walter continued, "Charles showed it to me when we were boys, explaining that it represented the Blackwell commitment to finding true north, not just geographical direction, but moral orientation. When your father became ill, he gave it to me for safekeeping, concerned it might be sold rather than preserved for you." Margaret's slight flinch at this implied criticism was visible, but she remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold. Without her management. James picked up the compass reverently, its significance clearly extending beyond the physical object to the conceptual guidance it represented. "True north," he repeated thoughtfully. "I think we've been finding our way back to that this past year." He looked around the table at the assembled family members. "Not by rejecting our history, but by seeing it more clearly. Both the achievements worth celebrating and the patterns worth changing." As dinner transitioned to dessert and coffee in the newly opened living spaces, I found myself drawn to the library where our family archive project was housed. The evening's conversations had included references to several historical events I wanted to note for future exploration. Connections between Blackwell family decisions and broader historical context that might illuminate intergenerational patterns. To my surprise, I found Margaret already there, carefully examining a collection of letters between Charles and his father during Charles's medical training. "I never read these while Charles was alive," she admitted when she realized I had entered. "He offered to share them, but I was disinterested in family history that predated my arrival." She returned the letters to their archival folder. "I was so determined to create my own narrative that I refused to understand the one I had married into." This self-awareness, the ability to recognize how her insecurities had driven behaviors that ultimately isolated her from meaningful connections, represented significant psychological growth. The Margaret who had crashed our anniversary dinner a year earlier had been incapable of such perspective on her own motivations. "It's never too late to understand different parts of the story," I offered, selecting a folder containing photographs from Charles's childhood. "These just came from his cousin Eleanor last week. There are several that include his parents at the lake house Walter mentioned." Margaret accepted the folder with visible appreciation for this small act of inclusion. As we reviewed the photographs together, I observed her integrating new information into her understanding of the man she had married, occasionally sharing insights about how certain characteristics had manifested in their relationship. "Charles had this same expression when he was thinking through a difficult diagnosis," she noted, indicating a photograph of his father deep in concentration. "I see it in James sometimes too, especially when he's working through a complex case." This acknowledgement of continuity across generations, the physical and temperamental inheritances that connected James to ancestors he had barely known, represented Margaret's growing capacity to see family as an interconnected system rather than competing individuals whose resources and affection must be controlled. Our quiet conversation was interrupted by sounds of laughter from the main living area, where James and Rebecca were apparently sharing stories that had the younger family members thoroughly entertained. Margaret listened for a moment, a complex emotion crossing her features. "They deserved to know each other better all these years," she acknowledged quietly. "Rebecca would have been a wonderful presence in James's life if I had allowed it." Rather than offering easy reassurance that might dismiss the significance of this lost connection, I nodded, respecting the importance of honest acknowledgement in the healing process. "Yes, she would have been. And it's meaningful that you can recognize that now." Margaret's therapy-influenced insight that acknowledging harm done was more important than being comforted for causing it reflected genuine growth rather than strategic adaptation. The woman who had once manipulated every family interaction to maintain her centrality was gradually developing the capacity to recognize others' experiences as valid, even when they reflected poorly on her choices. As we rejoined the main gathering, I witnessed another small but significant transformation in the family dynamic. James had discovered an old photo album and was sharing childhood pictures with his younger cousins, including several that showed Margaret in her early days of motherhood. Moments of genuine connection before control and deception became her primary parenting methods. Mom was amazing at creating adventures from ordinary days, he commented, indicating a photograph of Margaret helping a preschool-aged James build an elaborate fort from household items. She could transform a rainy afternoon into an Arctic expedition or a jungle safari. This balanced remembering, acknowledging positive truths alongside the more difficult realities of their relationship, represented James's evolving capacity to integrate complex, sometimes contradictory aspects of his family experience. Rather than swinging from idealization to rejection, he was developing a more nuanced understanding of Margaret as a flawed human with both genuine gifts and serious limitations. Margaret's response to this unexpected acknowledgement was equally revealing. Rather than seizing it as validation or using it to minimize her manipulations, she simply said, "You were a child who made it easy to be creative. Your curiosity made everything an opportunity for discovery." This reciprocal recognition, mother and son each acknowledging the other's genuine qualities without using them to erase difficult truths, created a moment of authentic connection more meaningful than the performed closeness Margaret had once insisted upon. As the evening progressed into late hours, guests gradually departed until only our closest circle remained. James and I, Rebecca, Walter, and Margaret. The intimate group gravitated to the library, where the Family Archive Project had created a natural gathering space for reflection on the past year's journey. "I've been thinking about resilience lately," Rebecca commented, indicating the organized collections of family documents surrounding us. Not just individual resilience, but family resilience across generations. How systems recover from disruption and sometimes emerge stronger for having faced it. Walter nodded thoughtfully. The Blackwells have faced significant disruptions. In every generation, financial reversals during the Depression, Charles's untimely death, and more recently, the unraveling of certain narratives. His diplomatic phrasing acknowledged Margaret's deceptions without unnecessarily highlighting them in this reflective moment. What makes some family systems adapt constructively while others become more dysfunctional after disruption? I asked, connecting their observations to my professional research interests. Is it about resources, communication patterns, or something more fundamental? "Truth," Margaret said unexpectedly, drawing surprised glances from everyone present. "I believe it's about the courage to face truth, particularly uncomfortable truth." She met our gazes with unusual directness. Our family system became increasingly dysfunctional because I prioritized comfortable fictions over difficult realities. Healing began when that pattern was finally disrupted. The insight, profound in both its accuracy and its source, created a moment of connection among the five of us that transcended the individual healing journeys we had each undertaken over the past year. Margaret's ability to articulate this understanding represented not just personal growth, but contribution to collective wisdom that might serve future generations. James reached for my hand, his expression reflecting appreciation for this unexpected breakthrough. "I think you're right, Mom, and I'm grateful that we've created space for truth, even when it's uncomfortable." As the conversation continued, exploring how family narratives shape identity and resilience across generations, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had unfolded since Margaret's interruption of our previous anniversary. What had begun as her desperate attempt to maintain control through selling a house that wasn't hers had instead catalyzed a profound transformation in family dynamics, individual growth, and our collective understanding of legacy. By the time the evening concluded and our final guests departed, James and I found ourselves alone in the renovated home that now truly reflected our vision rather than Margaret's carefully maintained illusions. Standing in the entrance hallway where we had greeted Margaret a year earlier, her champagne ambush still ahead of us, the symmetry of the moment felt both powerful and peaceful. "If you could go back to last year's anniversary, knowing what would unfold, would you change anything?" James asked, his arm around my shoulders as we surveyed the physical manifestation of our year's journey. the question deserved thoughtful consideration. The past year had brought pain alongside growth, difficult confrontations alongside meaningful reconnections. The process of uncovering Margaret's deceptions had required significant emotional and practical resources that might have been directed toward other aspects of our lives. I wouldn't change how we responded, I finally answered. But sometimes I wonder what might have happened if we'd recognized the patterns earlier, before they became so entrenched. If your father had addressed Margaret's financial behaviors more directly, or if I had questioned certain inconsistencies when we first got engaged. James nodded, understanding the complex counterfactual I was considering. I've had similar thoughts, but I'm not sure earlier interventions would have created the same opportunities for growth. Margaret wasn't ready to face these truths until her entire system of deception was on the verge of collapse. His insight reflected the psychological wisdom he had gained through both his professional training and our family's healing journey. Some transformations require crisis to create the necessary conditions for change, a principle applicable to both individuals and systems. What matters is that when the moment of truth arrived, we chose a path forward based on accountability, rather than retribution, I observed. We created conditions where growth was possible without guaranteeing or forcing specific outcomes. This approach, maintaining clear boundaries while allowing space for authentic transformation, had shaped our decisions from the initial confrontation with Margaret through the gradual rebuilding of family relationships. The results were evident, not just in Margaret's evolving behavior, but in the reconnections among extended family members and James's more integrated understanding of his heritage. As we moved through our home, turning off lights and closing up for the night, I paused by the display of family photographs in the entry hall. Among them was a new addition, a professional photograph taken earlier that evening of the entire gathered family, including Margaret. Unlike the carefully staged portraits she had once insisted upon, this image captured authentic connection, natural smiles, comfortable postures, the subtle physical echoes of shared genetics across generations. From a ruined anniversary to a family reclaimed, James reflected, noting my attention to the photograph. Not the transformation either of us expected a year ago. In our bedroom, the renovated master suite that now featured the original architectural details we'd discovered beneath Margaret's decorative changes, I opened the closet to hang up my dress from the evening. Beside it hung the burgundy dress, from our previous anniversary, professionally cleaned, but still maintaining a faint reminder of champagne in one small area that wouldn't quite release the stain. I touched it briefly, appreciating the tangible reminder of how unexpected catalysts can create transformative change. Margaret's champagne accident had been intended to disrupt our celebration and reassert her control. Instead, it had set in motion a journey of discovery that ultimately freed not just James, but the entire family system from patterns of deception that had limited authentic connection for decades. As James and I settled into the peaceful quiet of our home, the anniversary celebration successfully concluded, I reflected on the layered meanings of ownership that had emerged through our year's journey. Beyond the legal questions of who owned the physical house, questions definitively resolved through our discovery of the trust documents, deeper questions of who owned the family narrative, the interpretation of shared history, and the direction of future relationships had been fundamentally reconsidered. Margaret's attempt to maintain exclusive ownership of the Blackwell family story had ultimately failed, creating space for multiple perspectives, more authentic connections, and a shared stewardship of legacy that promised to serve future generations far better than her carefully controlled fictions. Sometimes I realized as sleep approached, the most valuable possessions we reclaim aren't physical spaces or material assets, but the authentic narratives and connections that allow us to integrate past and present, individual and collective, celebration and difficulty into a more complete understanding of who we are and what we might become. The champagne that had once stained my dress had long since dried, but its unexpected catalyst had created ripples of transformation that continued to shape our family in ways more meaningful than Margaret could have imagined when she crashed. Our anniversary dinner with her desperate attempt to maintain control. Sometimes the moments designed to break us become the very ones that set us free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.